If May 1763 was the month that the trap snapped shut, then June 1763 was the month that the teeth of that trap ground into the flesh of the British Empire. To the historian looking back, June 1763 is a scene of almost cinematic horror. The entire British defensive line in the American Midwest, a chain of forts stretching from the Pennsylvania woods to the shores of Lake Michigan, was systematically erased. What began as a bold conspiracy by Pontiac in May exploded in June into a total collapse of imperial authority. Forts fell like dominoes, garrisons were butchered, the frontier was pushed back 100 miles in 30 days. Yet, to the colonists living on the Atlantic seaboard, June 1763 was a month of confusing silence and terrifying rumors. The news was a fractured mosaic of secondhand reports. A writer would arrive in Philadelphia with the story of a burning fort. But a week later, a letter would arrive in New York claiming that all was well. The information lag, the time it took for news to travel from the Ohio Valley to the printing presses of the coast, it created a very surreal disconnect. The British Empire was losing a war that its citizens barely even knew was happening. You see, June of 1763 was the bloodiest month of the year. It contained military disasters in the West, the desperate biological warfare at Fort Pitt, the arrival of the Wilkes and Liberty scandal in the colonial press, and the terrifying realization in London that their cost-cutting measures had purchased a catastrophe. So first we'll look at the first week of June, which is essentially a bunch of domino effects, starting with the fall of Fort Watanan. As the month opened, the contagion of rebellion reached Fort Watanan near modern Lafayette, Indiana. Here was the deception. The local Wea, Kickapoo, and Muscatan tribes used the standard playbook. They invited the commander, Lieutenant Edward Jenkins, to a council in a cabin outside the fort, which then led to the capture. The moment he entered, he was seized. The warriors told him a simple truth. Detroit is besieged. St. Joseph is fallen. Miami is taken. Surrender now, and we will spare your men, which ultimately led to the surrender. Jenkins, realizing that he was isolated and outnumbered, surrendered. Unlike the butchery at other forts, the French inhabitants successfully negotiated for the lives of the British soldiers who were taken captive. The British flag came down, and the interior of Indiana was entirely lost. This was followed by the fall of Fort Michilimackinac. The next day, hundreds of miles to the north at the tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, the most dramatic and famous deception of the war took place. Here was the setting. It was the king's birthday. The garrison was relaxed. The local Ojibwa and Sauk tribes organized a massive game of lacrosse outside the fort's open gates. Once they got to the game, the soldiers watched, betting on the outcome. Matrons and young women stood near the open gates, wrapped in blankets, despite the warm June weather. And then here was the signal. Suddenly, the ball was hurled high into the air, arching over the fort's wall and landing inside. The players rushed through the gates, ostensibly to retrieve it. As they passed the women, they grabbed weapons hidden under the blankets, tomahawks, and sawed-off muskets, which ultimately led to the massacre. In minutes, it was over. Commander George Etherington and his lieutenant were seized. 15 soldiers were killed instantly. The rest were taken prisoner. The fort, the hub of the northern fur trade, was in native hands. While these forts were burning, General Jeffrey Amherst in New York was finally receiving the first reports from May. His reaction on June 6th was one of stubborn denial. He wrote to his subordinates that the savages were incapable of such a plan. He assumed that these were isolated riots, not a war. His arrogance, the belief that the British were invincible and the Indians were disorganized, blinded him to the strategic reality that his army was being dismantled piece by piece. The second week of June led to the Siege of the Mind and the panic in Philadelphia. By the second week of June, the fog of war began to lift in the middle colonies, replaced by the clarity of terror. Refugees from the frontier began pouring into Carlisle and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There were the stories. They brought tales of scalping parties, burning farmhouses, and the total cessation of trade. The Paxton region, which was the frontier of Pennsylvania, was in a frenzy. This then led to the political paralysis. The government in Philadelphia, dominated by pacifist Quakers, was, slow to react. They debated whether to send a militia or a peace delegation. To the Scots-Irish settlers on the frontier, this hesitation looked like complicity. The rage that would lead to the Paxton Boys massacre, later on in December, was being stoked in the terrified June weeks. And then came the fall of Fort Venango, which was approximately June 16th, somewhere around mid-June. The exact date is hazy because there were no survivors to tell the tale. Fort Venango, which is in Franklin, Pennsylvania, fell. Here's the horror. The Seneca warriors gained entry, slaughtered the entire garrison, and captured the commander, Lieutenant Gordon, which then led to the torture. In a grim escalation, Gordon was slowly roasted to death over a fire for 3 nights. He was forced to write a statement of the grievances of the tribes, specifically listing the high price of goods and the lack of respect, before he died. This was not just war. It was a message. And eventually, the colonists got the news of Wilkes. See, while the frontier burned, the coastal cities were reading about liberty. There was the arrival. Ships arriving in Boston and New York brought the full details of the John Wilkes affair and his arrest for North Britain number 45, which created quite an impact. You see, colonial newspapers in mid-June reprinted the story breathlessly. Wilkes was framed as a martyr for English liberty, a man standing up against the general warrants of an overreaching ministry. So what was the connection? Well, the colonists began to conflate their own situation with Wilkes. The frontiersmen felt abandoned by the government. The merchants felt squeezed by the government. And Wilkes was being persecuted by, the government. A narrative of corruption versus liberty began to take hold. The third week of June brought about a desperate defense and the fall of Fort Le Boeuf. On June 18th, the wave of destruction moved south toward Pennsylvania. Fort Le Boeuf, which is in Waterford, Pennsylvania, was attacked. Here was the escape. The commander, Ensign George Price, realized the fort was indefensible against the fire arrows raining down on the wooden blockhouse. Under cover of darkness, he and his garrison sneaked out the back, escaping into the woods. They made a desperate trek to Fort Pitt, arriving starving and terrified, bringing the news that the chain of forts was broken, which then led to the fall of Fort Presque Isle. This is on June 19th to 22nd. On the shores of Lake Erie, Fort Presque Isle, near Erie, Pennsylvania, made a heroic stand. See, here's the battle. Commander John Christie and his men held out for 2 days. They lived in the blockhouse, fighting off waves of attacks while the Indians tried to undermine the walls and set the roof on fire. The soldiers had to dig well inside the blockhouse floor to get water to put out the fires, but that still led to the surrender. Exhausted and out of options, Christie surrendered on the promise that they would be allowed to march to Fort Pitt. The promise was broken. The soldiers were seized and taken captive, which then leads to the siege of Fort Pitt, which happened on June 20th. Now, Fort Pitt, as you might imagine from the name, is in modern-day Pittsburgh. That was the last stronghold standing in the Ohio Valley. It was packed with over 600 people, soldiers, traders, women, children. Here were the conditions. The fort was overcrowded and filthy, but the real enemy wasn't the Delaware warriors outside the walls, it was inside. Smallpox had broken out in the hospital. That ultimately led to the negotiation. On June 24th, a parley would occur where the British officers, desperate to break the siege, would hand 2 blankets and a handkerchief from the smallpox hospital to the Delaware chiefs as a gift. This infamous act of biological warfare, sanctioned by Captain Ecoyer, reveals the sheer desperation of June 1763. The British had lost control of the continent and were resorting to any means necessary to survive. In the last week of June, we saw the awakening of empire. Specifically, the Bouquet expedition prepares. Back in Philadelphia, the British command finally accepted the magnitude of the disaster. Colonel Henry Bouquet, a brilliant Swiss officer, was ordered to assemble a relief column to march to Fort Pitt. But here was the problem. He had no soldiers. The British army had been demobilized. He had to scrape together a force of invalid veterans, sick Scots Highlanders, and raw recruits, ultimately for the march. In late June, Bouquet began the march west. It was a suicide mission in the eyes of many. He was marching into the same deep woods where General Braddock had been destroyed in 1755. The fate of the British presence in the West rested on this one patchwork battalion. So what was the London realization of all this? Well, in London, the news of the initial May uprisings began to trickle in by late June, which of course led to shock. The ministry was horrified. They had just signed a peace treaty. They had just demobilized the army to save money. Now they faced a new, expensive war. But that ultimately led them to their decision. This cemented the decision to keep the standing army in America permanently. It also accelerated the drafting of the Proclamation of 1763. The king's ministers decided that the only way to stop this bleeding was to physically separate the colonists from the Indians. They would draw a line down the mountains and say, "Stop, stay on this side." Of course, during this whole time, the economic collapse was deepening. The war news exacerbated the whole economic depression. First, there was the credit freeze. With the frontier on fire, the fur trade, a huge chunk of the colonial economy stopped dead. Merchants in New York and Philadelphia who had advanced goods to traders knew those goods were now stolen or burned. And this, of course, also led to more bankruptcy. In June of 1763, there was a wave of insolvencies. The land bubble burst. Speculators who had bought Western land in the spring now owned worthless war zones. So what was the texture of June 1763? Well, first of all, there was an overlying air of white captives. You see, June was a month of abduction. Hundreds of settlers, men, women, and children, were taken captive by the tribes, which led to this experience. While many men were tortured and killed, many women and children were adopted into the tribes to replace the dead. This created a strange cultural phenomenon. Years later, when peace came, many of these white Indians refused to return to white society, having found a life of greater freedom and equality among the tribes. There was also the religious response. You see, the clergy took to their pulpits in June with this interpretation. To the Puritan mind of New England and the Presbyterian mind of the frontier, this war was God's punishment. They had become too proud, too wealthy, too sinful. The savages were the scourge of God. The religious also saw this impact. This religious framing hardened the racial hatred. If the Indians were agents of the devil or God's wrath, then exterminating them wasn't a crime. It was a holy necessity. The racial violence of the American frontier became theological in June of 1763. As June 30th of 1763 faded into July. The British map of North America was a lie. The maps in London showed the Union Jack flying over the Great Lakes. The reality was that the British Empire stopped at the Appalachian Mountains. Everything west of that was Pontiacs. June 1763 was the month that the middle ground, the possibility of coexistence between the British Empire and the native peoples, died. See, for the British, the Indians were no longer neighbors to be managed. They were enemies to be crushed. For the Indians, the British were no longer fathers to be negotiated with. They were invaders to be driven out. And for the colonists, the British Army had failed them. It could not protect their farms, and it could not protect their trade. The seeds of independence were watered with the blood of June. The colonists began to ask a dangerous question. If the British Army can't fight the Indians, and we have to fight them ourselves, as the Paxton Boys would soon do, then why are we paying taxes to London for protection? June 1763 proved that the empire was overextended, underfunded, and out of touch. The trap had closed, and the only way out now would be revolution.